Welcome to this, our second Cockburn Conversation that kind of forms part of our annual Edinburgh Doors Open Days event. And quite extraordinarily, this is the 30th year that the Cockburn Association has been organising kind of Doors Open Days. And of course, events result in it being an entirely kind of virtual kind of activity. But with that being said, it's at the kind of very heart of Doors Open Days. It's about enabling people to get into buildings or places that they wouldn't usually be allowed to go, or to go into places where they might not usually think that they would wish to go. And it's in this kind of spirit that actually we've organized our kind of week-long kind of events of conversations to look at the kind of hidden and contested histories of this kind of city and the kind of influences that kind of affect it from afar. Obviously, we're using kind of Zoom as a platform, and for those of you who regularly attend Cockburn events, you'll notice a slight difference in functionality in that your video and microphone will be disabled for the duration of the event, but you can still ask questions through the Q&A kind of function, which we would encourage you to kind of do. We will be posting this live on Facebook when the connection with Facebook kind of gets going, but we're recording the kind of event as well. And if you do want to kind of tweet, please do. It'd be fantastic if you could. It's hashtag Cockburn Conversations. And remember all about this. It's always about being respectful of everybody else's kind of views. And if you've kind of enjoyed tonight's kind of event, or even last night if you were with us then, we're looking forward to Doors Open Days when we'll be launching the full program tomorrow sometime, hopefully in the afternoon. Do join our, go onto our website and become a member. Your support would be most appreciated, or even making a donation, large, hopefully large, or even small would be most appreciated. And every penny helps us continue with our work about protecting the amenity of this great city of ours. So without any further kind of ado, with all that business out of the way, I'd like to kind of introduce our two conversationalists for tonight's thing, led by our chairman, Professor Cliff Hague. And joining him is Professor Euan Hague, who is the Professor of Geography and Director of the School of Public Service in DePaul University in Chicago. Now, the swift ones in you might notice there being a relationship both physically when you look at it in terms of the kind of name, and well, that's not surprising because it's a great father and son team we have actually going for tonight. You can decide who's the beauty and who's the smart one. I leave that kind of over to you. Maybe we'll have a competition afterwards. But without any further ado, Chairman, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us this evening for this Cockburn Conversation. Last night we had a very good discussion with Professor Jeff Palmer, who focused particularly on the hidden history of slavery and the slavery connections from Scotland. And tonight we're continuing this international theme by looking at the issues around Confederate memorials in the USA, which Euan has been doing a lot of work on. So welcome again to everybody, particularly welcome and thanks to Euan for doing this. And maybe we can start off, Euan, by asking, how does somebody who was born and brought up in Edinburgh finish up looking at Confederate memorials in the United States?
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate in these Cockburn conversations. So I did geography as an undergraduate at University of Bristol, and then moved on to a master's degree, and then I took the opportunity to pursue a PhD in Syracuse, New York, and that kind of got me engaged in the Scottish American community, the whole network of the Highland Games. This was in the mid-1990s. I moved to New York State in 1994, and as a result, this is the era of Braveheart, which came out in 1995, and there was just a huge interest in the United States. There's this huge interest in Scotland, and so as I was finishing my PhD, I was really writing about the Scottish American diaspora community. And I wasn't really interested in the Confederate Commemoration at that time. But towards the end of that process, a person got in touch with me, Edward Sebesta, who was an anti-Confederate activist based in Texas. And he asked me, he'd heard about my work, and he'd asked me about the Confederacy's connections with Scotland, and was I aware that there was a group of people who were supporting Confederate monuments and basically writing academic articles to justify the Confederacy. And was I aware of this? Because one of the things that they were doing was emphasizing connections to Scotland, and this was highly unusual to me. I had no idea about any of these connections, but these contemporary groups involved, including a group called the League of the South, were led by people who had written a number of texts. They were faculty members, primarily in history departments across the American South, who'd written books on topics like Celtic. I remember reading one called Celtic Warfare by James Michael Hill, which made the argument that the Irish, the Highlanders, and the Confederates used the same tactics in battles, and therefore that demonstrated that the Confederates were genetically Celtic, and that the Civil War was a battle between Celts and Anglo-Saxons, which is an entirely bizarre thesis, and one that was roundly criticized by historians throughout the United States in the 1980s when it was first made. But I think one of the things that the internet did in the mid-90s was it gave new life to some of these ideas. And so one of the things I became interested in was these efforts by people trying to understand the Confederacy and argue that it was a Celtic or a Scottish-Irish, somehow it was a sort of last bastion of Celtic resistance to Anglo-Saxon norms. So a very strange idea. And then the more I dug into it, the more I began to find how Scotland resonated with this audience. You would go to I went to a Scottish Highland Games in Dallas and saw members of this organization speaking about how farming techniques in the American South, and this was written very large. There was no discussion of slavery, but farming techniques sort of allowing free-range cattle were also seen in Scotland and Ireland, and arguments like this. And so there was this belief among a group of academics that the American South and the Confederacy in the 19th century was culturally Celtic. And I was very resistant to that argument, and suppose I spent part of my book on neo-Confederacy sort of challenging that concept. But then I found that in more contemporary times, the organizations had put forward a Confederate memorial tartan. And that tartan, which are drawn on Confederate colors, primarily a gray, because the Confederate army dressed in gray uniforms, was approved by the Scottish Tartans Authority. And then you had even more things, other things that were surprising to me, like one of the major organizers of this group called the League of the South was a philosophy professor from Georgia, a man called Donald Livingston, who made the argument that he drew on David Hume's writings to justify Confederate secession. And so there was all kinds of these strange, it kept sort of popping up. There was this I don't want to say it's a concrete connection, but there was just these ideas that Scotland resonated to some degree with these people's interpretations of the Confederacy. And so from there, I began to look more and more into the Confederate heritage movement. And as a geographer, I was particularly interested in how movements claim places and how they mark those places and challenge meanings of places. And so that led me to begin to look at Confederate monuments as well. And sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting in comparison to last night with Jeff Palmer, where in a sense Jeff was talking about how Scotland's slavery connection was sort of hidden, whereas this is almost the reverse process. Scotland in the New World was hidden in the Scottish histories, but what we're seeing here is people in the New World kind of finding or fabricating a Scottish connection and making it very mainstream in their self-identities.
Yeah, I think to some extent that's the case. And I think the other thing I should point out is that there's a lot of writing about the Scottish immigrant community to the United States that identifies Scottish people arriving in the United States as invisible immigrants. There's a woman called Charlotte Erickson wrote this famous book, famous in these circles, called Invisible Immigrants, which said, as Scots arrived, they were primarily Protestant and primarily spoke English, so they're able to integrate a lot more easily than maybe the Catholic Irish were, or something like that. And so what we've actually seen, it's much more, and even in the American Civil War, many Scots sided against the Americans. Many Scots fought against the Americans. Many were loyalists. And so one of the interesting things is this construction in the second half of the 20th century of this link, supposed link between the Confederacy and Scotland, and this sort of increased resonance. And I think one of the things that, from a UK perspective or from a Scottish perspective, people might not be familiar with, but the bicentennial in 1776 in the United States really pushed a lot of people to begin to research ancestry in a way that previously when immigrants came, they would have ethnic organizations. I'm a member of the St. Andrew's Society of Illinois, which is over 150 years old, the oldest charity in the state of Illinois here in Chicago. But what happened was their ethnic identities would be shed as they became assimilated into being American. But in the mid-1970s, the legacy of the civil rights era, you have this effort by European Americans to reclaim their ancestry. So we see a lot of Scottish heritage organizations forming in the late 70s, a lot of Scottish American publications coming in the late 70s. And then that accelerates in the 90s. And the thing that really intersects in the 1990s is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we're not really on the built environment. I realize that we're sort of moving away, but the collapse of the Soviet Union gives an impetus to nationalist movements worldwide. And in the United States, you had this group of pro-Confederate intellectual academics in history departments in the American South who formed the League of the South and deliberately model it on Italy's Lega Nord and to some extent the Scottish National Party as well, and look towards these European nationalist movements and nationalist political parties for inspiration. I should point out that these efforts were always unrequited. It was very much America, these particular people looking towards Europe. So I got into looking at some of these memorials, and maybe I could share some photos so people can see a little bit. So I put together some photos, and I want to, and we can maybe talk about these. I think one of the things for people to recognize is that Confederate commemoration in the United States is considerably more extensive than just the statues. You can see it. This is a statue of Silent Sam in the top left here. Silent Sam was a Confederate statue erected on the University of North Carolina campus. It was recently torn down by students, but for a long time, this stood on the campus of the University of North Carolina. And here, I don't know if you can see there, but this is Confederate Memorial Hall at Vanderbilt University, a donation by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1920s led to the construction of this building as a residential and classroom for women. And the university there has been dealing with this as well and has recently just dropped the word Confederate and renamed it Memorial Hall. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is when Confederate commemoration has happened. And so you can see here, this was a organization I've done some work with called the Southern Poverty Law Center, tracking monuments, tracking schools named after Confederates. And so what we see here, this is 1910. We can see a big peak in the number of monuments being erected around 1910. So if you think about it, that's 50 years or so after the Civil War. A lot of the veterans, the last of the veterans are dying off, and we see this burst of Confederate commemoration around about 1910. And then here we have 1960 as another kind of peak, the sort of civil rights era. And you can see here a lot of green dots, a lot of schools were named after Confederate leaders in the 1960s. So I think one thing to point out is a lot of this Confederate commemoration is actually relatively recent and does not date from the Civil War era itself.
Yeah, I think that's quite notable, isn't it? Because usually, you think after the First World War, Second World War, your monuments go up pretty quickly afterwards. But this is quite a long delay, isn't it? Almost, you said 50 years. It's also, I think, the period of Jim Crow in the States, isn't it? That sort of early 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, I think people normally argue that Jim Crow happens from 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which codified separate but equal, right through till the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. So that's kind of the period that we identify as Jim Crow, when segregation was legal.
So let's go on to the next one.
Okay, yeah, and so here's a couple of other interesting photographs. I took this one here of the blank pedestal. So this is kind of one of the things I think that's really interesting about Confederate commemoration is a lot of the statues are mass produced in the 1910s and 1920s, and cities and towns all over the US bought the statues and erected them in public places. So this
so you could sort of buy them out of a catalog, you mean?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, there was and it wasn't just, they were made all over the US. There was one manufacturer in Ohio, which was a northern state, which is the Union state, which would produce a generic bronze figure of a soldier, and you could just, and it sold, and you could just buy it on, I couldn't buy it online, could you? You could just buy it from a catalog. So yeah, these were mass produced in the 1910s, 1920s. So here's a Confederate general. This stood outside the Art Museum in New Orleans, and this statue was there probably for almost 80, 90 years. And then when I was in New Orleans recently, I noticed it had been removed. You can see how it's been ripped down here. And I think the other thing that's interesting that's happening now in the United States is that a lot of the statues, a lot of the debate is where the statues are. Are they on public land, therefore being supported by taxpayer money? Are they on private land? Here's Jefferson Davis Park here. Jefferson Davis was a Confederate president. You can see here it says established 2007. This is the same park beside the road. And this is on privately owned land owned by the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And you can see here this park was established in 2007. This statue, which is supposedly, it's pretty garish, but this statue is of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is a Confederate military officer and the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. This is a privately owned statue on private property overlooking one of the main motorways in Tennessee. So if you're driving on the motorway, I-65, if you're driving on the interstate motorway, you will be able to see this, but it's not on public property, it's on private land. It's 25 or 30 feet tall with flagpoles around it. So one of the things that we've seen in the United States is as the pressure has come to tear down monuments, a lot of the reaction has been to put them on private land and therefore remove them from the jurisdiction of the state. One of the projects I was particularly interested in, if we go beyond the statues, is the Jefferson Davis Highway. This was an effort by groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are still active in a lot of this work. And this was not actually an official named road. This was an unofficial highway. What happened was this. You can kind of see a little bit from this map. It dates from 1926, and you can see a little bit from the map is that the blue of the title and the blue of the Jefferson Davis Highway have been kind of superimposed. And so what happens was you would have map companies produce these blank maps, and then organizations would basically layer on top of it where they wanted their highway to go. And so this Jefferson Davis Highway, the important thing was it went all the way from Washington, D.C., right through the South, through Texas, through Arizona, New Mexico, out to San Diego. And so eventually they tried to make it go all the way through California and up into Canada as well, which I'll come to in a moment. And so what happens was throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, with permission of the various states, would elect markers along this route. They'd elect markers along this route to claim it. So even though the road never had the official name, Jefferson Davis Highway, you would find these markers all the way along the route. The one place it did not go was Oregon. So it went through California on the West Coast, skipped Oregon because no state officials in Oregon would give them permission to locate a marker there, and then went into Washington state and up into Canada. And so one of the interesting things was you had situations where here's a highway marker in Arizona. Arizona was not a state when the Confederacy existed. Arizona did not become a state till the 20th century. But the Confederacy in the 19th century, we still see efforts by local groups to put up, local United Daughters of Confederacy putting up a marker to this. This one here used to be on the border between the United States and Canada, but they moved it. But one of the first monuments you used to be able to see as you came into the United States was a Jefferson Davis Highway marker. And then this one here, you can see in the pavement here. It took me a long time to find this marker, but this is in the pavement in San Diego in California. And you can see I've blown it up on the right here. And you can notice from this as well that it was first erected in 1926, relocated in 1956, and then actually that 1956 element was removed when they redeveloped this area of San Diego. And so that must have been embedded in the ground in about 1990 or so. So these are still kind of relatively prevalent.
So what's wrong with having Confederate monuments and naming highways after Confederate leaders?
Well, I think one of the things to point out is obviously the Confederacy was a rebellion against the government of the day, right? It's a civil war. The people who fought for it were, I guess, technically committing treason against the United States. And so you've got this strange situation where throughout the United States, even in locations like California was a Union state, you know, opposed the Confederacy. Arizona didn't exist as a state. Even in locations throughout the US, you've got this very strange commemoration of the defeated opponents of the United States. And so the question then becomes, okay, what were they fighting for? And it's very clear from the public record and the state constitutions that in the Confederate States that they were fighting for the right to retain slaves and to retain slavery, which they felt was going to be dismantled by the northern states. So the critical effort was to enable white supremacy. And so I think and obviously I'm a white person from Scotland, and I think there's a great article by the Guardian journalist Gary Young, many people know is of African descent, and he talks about walking through Richmond, Virginia, and just seeing all these Confederate statues, and just the kind of banal daily recognition that the people venerated here are the people who wanted to retain slavery. And so what I think we see with things like the Black Lives Matter campaign and others here in the United States is that these aren't necessarily gravestones. These are monuments put up 50, 60, 70 years after. Imagine if you're an African-American child, and again, obviously I can't put myself in those shoes, but going to a school named after Robert E. Lee and learning about what the Confederacy was about. I mean, I think that has got to, have some impact. And so I think it's just very strange and also quite a clear way of sending a symbolic message about what's important is by having parks, schools, streets named after these Confederate leaders, and also having these statues towering over you as you're walking down the street.
Just pulling things together a little bit then, it's important, what you're saying, it's not just something that's happening in the South, it's not just something that's happened historically. it's still very active, this attempt to memorialize an image of the Confederacy. And what kind of image of the Confederacy is it that is championed? How is it depicted?
Yeah, so it's depicted as being local resistance to an authoritarian central government, about the imposition, or it's about the slavery is kind of explained away as being very benevolent and paternalistic. These people were introduced to the enslaved peoples were just like one of the family. They were introduced to Christianity. They were given the opportunities of life in America. I mean, it's just this completely different reading. And I say one of the things that a lot of the academics that I was reading were writing about were these explanations of slavery. It's often called a lost cause. It's often called a lost cause myth. That and you know, perhaps the most famous embodiment of this is a film like Gone with the Wind, which was, you know, Gone with the Wind was written in the 1930s and filmed in the 1930s, and so it was very much this nostalgia for this idea of an innocent time where local people had local power and there was no overarching federal government. And so quite often the argument is localities or states should be able to make their own policies. You often hear a states' rights argument as opposed to the federal government shouldn't be telling us what to do. You'll hear this idea of that slavery was benevolent, that slave owners were paternalistic, that slaves were worth money, therefore why would you abuse them? And so there's I just saw it pop up in the chat. Birth of a Nation. That's a great example. Birth of a Nation. So Birth of a Nation is a 1915 silent film, very famous for its cinematic techniques, which was a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, which arose to restore white supremacy in the South. But Birth of a Nation was based on a novel called The Klansman, spelt with a small c, not a k, by a guy called Thomas Dixon. And that book, The Klansman with a small c, drew heavily on the writings of Walter Scott. And they actually talk about cross burning in The Klansman as the rallying cry of the clans of old Scotland. So that was another of those weird Confederate Scottish connections that introduced me. Sorry, I was off on the tangent there. What was your question again?
I can't remember either, actually. So now it's clearly become highly controversial, highly politicized, not least in this election year. And so given the pressures that are coming, perhaps particularly in some of the Democrat-controlled cities and urban areas, how is the kickback taking place as people attempt to defend these? Is it a case that these are part of our kind of heritage in the built environment?
Yeah,
what sort of measures do they use to protect them?
That's a really interesting point that you make. You see a tension, and you probably pick it up from the United Kingdom, but a lot of the biggest cities have Democratic mayors, whereas the state legislators are Republicans. So somewhere like Alabama, you'll have a Democratic mayor in one of the big cities, but the state governor will be a Republican. Atlanta, Georgia, there was just a big battle between the mayor of Atlanta, who wanted to impose a face mask ordinance, and the governor of Georgia, who's a Republican, who took them to court to try and block it. And so you see these tensions. And so one of the things that we've seen in a state like Alabama is that the state legislator has passed a law, and the state legislation in Alabama is from 2017, so only a couple of years ago. In 2017, the state of Alabama passed a law that any city removing a statue over 40 years old, that was illegal, and if the city did it, they would be fined. And so you have this sort of tension between the cities and the state legislators. So one of the things that we've seen is states passing legislation. It's the state passing legislation. And by the state, I mean Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, as opposed to the federal government. It's the states that are individually passing legislation that says these statues are part of our history and our heritage, and therefore they cannot be torn down. And if you tear them down, there is a price to pay, be it a monetary fine or whatever. So we actually see these disputes now between the city government, the mayor of a city, and the state governor over whether a statue can be torn down. And again, that's really interesting about the jurisdiction that it's under. Is a state in a, if it's located in a city, is it the city's property? But the city is, of course, embedded in the state. And so what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, actually the last 5 years, particularly since the killings in the shootings in the church in Charleston, there's been a number of state legislators passing a rule saying you can't take down a statue over 40 years old. You can't change the name of a building if it's over 40 years old. And of course, you count back 40 years, you get to about 1980, 1975, 1980, which is at the end of that period, of that timeline of civil rights that we saw in the initial slide. And so I think the other thing that's interesting is the role of heritage organizations.
Okay, just interject, because
yeah.
that situation where, you know, the state is overruling the city seems quite contradictory to the argument that the federal state shouldn't overrule the states. I mean, it's an argument for a more local basis of decision making.
Right. Well, there's this there's a lot of this is, I believe it's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and this is where I have to defer to those people who grew up in the US and learned their Constitution. But there is a clause, there's an amendment to the Constitution, I believe it's the 10th, and this is beloved by the pro-Confederates, that says anything not articulated in this Constitution defers to the state. And so therefore, they would make an argument that the state gets to control that territory. But obviously, again, as a faculty member in geography, as a professor of geography, these different claims to identity at different scales what makes it so fascinating.
So I cut you off. So tell us about the role of the heritage organizations.
Well, I wanted to get a word in that. So, so what you've seen as well now is like the National Trust for Historic Preservation over here, the big national heritage organization, for a long time was kind of non-committal. I mean, these statues are old, right? They're 100 years old, and in the United States, 100 years counts as old. I live in Chicago. The city was founded in 1837. You know, I remember Cliff. I don't know if you remember, Cliff, when you and my mom came to visit me in Syracuse. One of the local attractions was the 1895 house, and that was and you were like 1895, you know. But but the National Heritage Organizations have done a couple things in the last couple of years. Firstly, they have explicitly aimed to put funding to preserve sites associated with African American history and other minority histories, and very explicitly moved to try and tell full stories of the full story of what happened at sites, including about slavery and discrimination. You also see them saying that the statues need to come down, I think. And I think or come down and be put in museums. I think that's another interesting point as well. There's a big difference between a statue overlooking a motorway and a statue inside a museum. And I think that's another thing, is this, how do you encounter that statue in the everyday landscape? And I think that's another really interesting element. If it's something that you walk past every day and it's on your route from home to school, it's going to have a different impact than it would inside a museum with more contextualization. So I think the national associations have really come down, okay, we need to preserve African American history, contextualize the sites that we own and the signage, and recognize that the statues should be moved off of public land. But you have a lot of these places that are small privately owned museums, small privately owned pieces of land. And so they obviously can do pretty much what they want with them. And so you've got this contest now between what is state sanctioned, national parks or state heritage areas, and what is privately owned. And so I think you see a divergence in the stories that are being told in these different sites.
So that idea of discovering and celebrating the hidden histories of particularly African-American groups, perhaps leads us on towards wrapping up and asking, what are you actually doing now in Chicago? What are you working on now? And how do we go about finding hidden histories?
I'm actually working with I got a friend here, he's called Michael James, who was part of the Students for a Democratic Society and quite involved in the 1968 Democratic National Convention protests. And he's introduced me to a lot of his friends. And so what we're trying to do is...
Just for people who may not be of my generation, what was the 1968 Democratic Convention protest?
1968, the Democratic National Convention was held here in Chicago to nominate a challenger to Richard Nixon. And at that time, the Democratic Party were the party in power and had basically intensified the war in Vietnam. And so as a result, the anger against the war in Vietnam was focused on the Democratic Party, which was the party of government. They eventually lost the election in the November to Richard Nixon. But there was these huge protests. There was soldiers on the streets with bayonets and guns. It was officially the Walker Report declared a police riot. Police were, fighting protesters on the streets here in Chicago. But out of that, there was a lot of local organizing. So we're trying to uncover and find the sites associated with, there was a group here in Chicago called Rising Up Angry. They probably only have a Wikipedia page because one of their old members put it up, but they ran a free health clinic, a free breakfast program, a free legal clinic. You had groups like Jobs Are Inc. Now, which is called Join here in Chicago, which ran for poor white people a school and helped with rent strikes and challenged landlords. A lot of these groups were influenced by the late 1960s by the Black Panther Party, which here in Chicago had a health clinic, a free breakfast program, and so forth. And so what we do is we take the students to the locations, we get a member of that organization, and we go to this location, and it's a nondescript building with no historic markings. It's just, you wouldn't know that that was the headquarters of this organization or that this person lived there. There's no markings. And I think one of the things that the internet enables us to do is to record history on interactive maps. And so we're really looking to identify the hidden histories. There was a gay bar here in Chicago called The Trip, which was raided twice in 1968 and really galvanized the gay population. So to try to mark that location, you go to an old phone book or you go to an old map and you find the address of that property. And so sometimes you'll just see an image, a photo in a museum, or you'll read a chapter, you'll read an autobiography, and it will say, oh, at this address, this happened. And I'll say, wait a minute, that needs to be recorded. We need to go to that address and record it. One that I'm particularly, that is unmarked, that I think should be marked. There was a Union and anarchist leader in the 1880s here called Albert Parsons, who actually, take us back, he fought with the Confederacy briefly in the 1860s. But it was a big labor organizer who lived here in Chicago, and he was arrested following a terrorist bombing. The first bombing in the United States was here in Chicago in 1886. And he was in the general area at the time. He was not involved. He definitely didn't throw the bomb. He'd left the scene by the time the bomb was thrown, but he was arrested and executed. But the house where he lived on the day the bomb was thrown in 1886 still stands. And you wouldn't know it by walking past. And so I think, there's places like that that are associated with labor activism, gay rights, women's rights, what in the UK would be BAME rights, that are, they're in people's heads, people who are, people who are in their 60s, 70s, who maybe lived through some of these struggles 50, 60 years ago. They know where these places are. And I think historic preservation has to think about not just what it's preserving as a physical infrastructure, but what history is therefore highlighted in that act of preservation.
So would you have any messages for Edinburgh from your experiences?
I mean, the US is so contested in so many ways, but I think, you know, Edinburgh has to have, I know it's got sites associated with slavery, but it's also got sites associated with the resistance to slavery. And there's no reason why both can't be marked and explained. It's obviously must have sites associated with gay rights struggles and recognition of gay rights. It obviously must have, if you go back, we're celebrating in the United States here, it's 100 years since the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. There must be sites associated in Edinburgh with women's suffrage in the British context. Where they are, I don't know. And so I think it becomes an effort in identifying places, reading old newspapers, reading the Scotsman in 1915 and seeing what it says about the suffrage movement. You know, it's a great stuff for a graduate student to be getting involved with. But then I think the other great thing, especially now with something like having interactive mapping, having story maps, having maps online, was you can make your alternative history of, you know, or your alternative history of Edinburgh, or your women's rights history of Edinburgh. And I think that is a really great thing for a heritage association to be thinking not just about the built environment, but, you know, who are the people associated with these places? Not just the buildings, but what are the people? I mean, for all their faults, you know, some of these people led lives that can be contextualized and discussed. So I think that's a critical element of it.
And of course, just to finish, we've seen, as I know you know, the commemoration of a Confederate grave here in Edinburgh. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I didn't know anything about it until you sent me the link the other day. But I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 20 years as the public commemoration of the Confederacy and therefore its associations with white supremacy have become ever more discredited. We've seen small Confederate heritage organizations like the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of Confederacy, try to catalog and mark every site associated with Confederates. And so that's become international. It's become, there's obviously people who were from Ireland, but there's graves in Ireland that have been recently marked. And I think there's a big difference between the grave in Edinburgh that was put up in 1860 or 1870 or whenever it was, and the new markers and the new flags put up there in the last 5 years. And I think that's a really interesting thing, is that we see groups in the US trying to internationalize the Confederacy, trying to make it seem, I think that they're doing that by tracking down the individuals who fought for the Confederacy, and then putting new markers on their grave, highlighting them again, highlighting them anew for another generation, just at the time where the sort of public veneration of this and the public money being used to venerate the Confederacy is being pulled away from them.
Yeah, somebody's just asking about where the grave is. It's in Dean Cemetery, and it's I think maybe, I'm not sure I've got the name quite right. I think it was Robert Smith, who was a Scot who was killed at a battle in Tennessee during the Civil War, and he's buried there. But as you're saying, the original monument presumably was put up not that long after he died as a standard sort of grave amongst others in the cemetery. But then more recently, the last decade, it's been kind of added to a plaque, which is from a Sons of Confederate Veterans group in a town in Tennessee. And there's Confederate flags and so forth associated with it. Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time, so I think I'm going to hand back to Terry to let him pick up. I think, yeah, we've just got a link there to where you can see an image of that grave and a short video of it. So I'll hang back to Terry and see if we've got any questions that we want to wrap up with.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cliff, and thank you, Euan. That was just a kind of a brilliance, you know, skittle through kind of all sorts of kind of issues. And we've had a number of questions come in, so I'll kind of put them sort of in the order they've popped in. But there's a first question which is around schools, and you made that quite fascinating kind of thought about kind of a black child who's educated in school called Robert E. Lee and the implications of that. One of the debates happening kind of in Edinburgh now is around James Gillespie's both primary school and secondary school, where many former pupils are very proud of their association with the school, but many younger people are less so because of the links of Gillespie's to slavery. What kind of strategies do you put in place to kind of manage that kind of process and that dialogue in between competing communities?
And I think the thing, I think a lot of these debates are more viscerally felt in the US, and it's really interesting that Edinburgh is getting engaged in these debates. And I went to Boroughmuir, so we're down the street from Gillespie's, and so they were always kind of the local, the local adversaries. But I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think the very fact that people are having a debate, and obviously James Gillespie is a complex figure in that the school is established as a result of a bequest to educate Edinburgh's poor children, and yet he's made his money from I believe it was tobacco, which obviously relied on slave labor in the United States. So there's this. I think history is gray; it's not black and white. And I think I think having these debates, having these discussions, explaining the context, explaining how it all worked, is great. And I think that just gives us a much more nuanced understanding. People leave complicated lives, and they led complicated lives in 1776, and they led them complicated lives in 2020. So I think you could go and rename all the schools, but then again, I think there's a difference between a state school and a private school, versus what is taxpayer money supporting versus private money. So I think you get into a lot of debates, and I don't have an answer. I mean, people have often asked me, what would I do with the monuments that are on public property here? And I just leave them, and I wouldn't pay. I wouldn't pay to upkeep them anymore. I think a lot of the ones that have not been removed are getting graffitied and tagged, and there was one in Arizona that got tarred and feathered. And so, I think people are having their own conversations with them. But I think something like a school is difficult to have a name. But I think you have the debate, and you have information, and all the people coming out of that school going forwards understand the complexities of history.
Okay, brilliant. Great. Thank you for that. I've got another question which will come out here, and I was wondering if you have anything to say about the Northern Irish connection, where some kind of loyalists celebrate the Scottish-Irish achievements, including Confederate figures.
Yeah, I don't know a huge amount about that. I apologize, but there's this thing in the US that I'd never encountered until I came here, called the Ulster Scots. It was the idea that people, Protestants who were moved to Northern Ireland in, I want to say, again, this is not my area, 17th century, maybe a bit before, moved to Northern Ireland, and then they or their descendants moved on to what became the United States. That time, obviously, it was British North America. And so there's this veneration. There's been a number of books which are very thinly move towards a kind of genetic inbuilt Scottish, Irish, and then that gets kind of morphed as Celtic, Appalachian fighting heroic masculinity. There was one called Born Fighting by James Webb, who was a former government official, a former secretary of the Navy, and served in government for the state of Virginia. There was another one very more recently called Hillbilly Elegy by James Vance Jr., which got a lot of publicity over here, about this sort of veneration of this hard scrabble Scots-Irish population, which by definition is white. And I think that's another thing that's kind of interesting in these celebrations of ethnic ancestry in the United States. Is it's difficult to say, I support my white heritage. It's a lot easier to say I support my Celtic ancestry or something like that. So it gets very, very complicated, and it becomes quite a minefield for discussion.
Yeah, I can get to see that, and keeping that minefield going. There's a question about there's an interesting question about the influence of David Hume on the Confederacy and some of his thoughts. So, are there any
Okay.
thoughts you have on that, or any
Okay,
evidence?
where did who planted that question? No, so the Hume stuff is really bizarre, and I was rereading it in preparation what I'd written 20 years ago. But Hume wrote an argument for American secession in 1776 from the British Empire, which is basically a devolution argument. And so some people within these Confederate intellectual circles drew on that idea of Hume, and in quite dense philosophical treatises began to advocate for the Confederacy from a Humean perspective, if this makes sense. There was a book called, and so within the Hume scholars community, there was a lot of academics criticizing these interpretations of Hume, whereas some of these pro-Confederate academics were sort of saying, they weren't saying we're pro-Confederate, we're saying we're interpreting Hume's thinking. So obviously Hume had passed away by the time the Civil War had happened, and so it becomes an exercise in how do we use somebody's arguments to make an argument for ourselves. But the ultimate thing that the pro-Confederate Humeans, if that's even a thing, the pro-Confederate Humeans argued was that small state governance should be the government should be without an overarching dominant federal government. It should be and becomes an argument about state formation, state construction, governments devolve to local levels, and the ability of a small, again, it's this sort of ability of a small, perhaps landed elite to run things, which is, if you think about it, is kind of the foundation of the United States.
Indeed. I've got two more questions for you as we kind of go. One is whether you could signpost any kind of research to kind of help people look at the links in between the US Southern political economy and the UK reappraisal of its public monuments and commemorizations. Or is that your life work at the moment?
No, it's not. No, my life work's filling in forms. I don't know off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I think sitting over here, obviously in the US, in Chicago, which is a very democratic city, in probably the most democratic constituency in that democratic city.
You just said that's Democratic with a capital D.
Yeah, sorry, Democratic Party. Yeah, the Democratic Party. You don't. I've been reading the coverage from in the UK, obviously in various media on my phone, and I think it's really interesting how the Black Lives Matter has kind of become this transatlantic movement now in a way that it maybe wasn't when Black Lives Matter began here 5-10 years ago. And I think there's definitely this increased recognition. There's a number of books that were written about Scottish American connections, and I'm happy to supply the Cockburn with a reading list. The work of Andrew Hook, who is a faculty member at the University of Glasgow for a long time. Andrew Hook has written a couple of books about this, and more recently, Duncan Sim at University of Stirling has written a couple of books as well about the modern Scottish diaspora. They don't necessarily tie into contemporary stuff happening in the UK, but there's two names, Andrew Hook and Duncan Sim, would be people to look up their work as examples.
Fantastic. That's really useful. And as a final question, we've been talking about a particular form of contested kind of history within it, but of course in North America and indeed in other parts of the world, there's the added dimension of the First Nations peoples. Yep. And how does that additional layering of perhaps there being a third contested history enter into this discussion?
It just gets incredibly complicated. So there was some tribal groups in the South that had slaves. There were some that allied with the Confederacy and some that didn't. There was some communities of free African Americans who integrated with Native American groups in the slave era. And so it really gets very, very complicated. And there's been some discussions of that. I think and of course, you know, the US federal government was moving Native Americans off land and moving them westwards. But also there's been some contests over how the Native American history is represented. And so there's actually, just to go back to the West, I believe it's in Arizona or New Mexico, and I'd have to check, but there's a statue of a Spanish priest or Spanish, I don't know if it's a priest or a Spanish military officer, but the Spanish officer, there's a statue to him as the founder of the Spanish settlement in this western state. And he was notorious for punishing Native Americans by cutting off one of their feet. And that statue, for many years, regularly has somebody come in the middle of the night and cut his foot off. And so even these statues, even the Native American population is sort of resisting. And of course, the most egregious, and this is one, and obviously my father knows my wife's family is from South Dakota, where the Black Hills are. And the Black Hills is where Mount Rushmore is. And so you had this site that was of spiritual significance to the Native Americans in that area become this shrine, I mean, you've got to go there and see it to believe it, but Mount Rushmore becomes this huge mountain-sized celebration of the United States. And it's deliberately put on one of the most holy sites of arguably one of the final most resistant Native American populations in the West. And you still have that kind of, and Mount Rushmore was built in the 1920s through the 1940s, which reminds me of another Confederate monument, Stone Mountain. In Georgia, near Atlanta, Georgia, Stone Mountain is this giant granite batholith, which the designer of Mount Rushmore also put a Confederate monument into the side of the mountain. And it's a bas relief frieze, bas relief sculpture of Confederate generals in the side of the mountain. Look it up online, Stone Mountain, Georgia. And so we often see, I think in Edinburgh, when I was growing up, I knew about Mount Rushmore. I didn't know its history. And there's a good book called Great White Fathers about the construction of Mount Rushmore. But to sort of see the same thing done on a mountain outside of Atlanta, Georgia, with a giant frieze of of Confederate leaders, it just sort of makes you realize, and it was built again around the same time, 1915, 1920. I think it's always interesting, just the bravado and the self-assurance that you can go to a mountain range that another people finds sacred and blow it up to put your own presidents on there. It's just, I mean, America sometimes. So I think it's just everywhere you look, there's an interesting hidden history behind a statue. And I think that's something that people are now uncovering.
Just to add that in South Dakota, not far from Mount Rushmore, there is a kind of counterpoint with the Crazy Horse Monument.
Yep. Yeah, so they're blowing up another mountain to build a statue to Crazy Horse, but the difference is that is private land, people donate privately to the charity doing that, whereas of course Mount Rushmore is a national monument supported by federal taxpayer dollars. And that contrast, you see it all over. I mean, I think we could go on for another hour, but I think it's really interesting, these different scales of government and different ways monuments and commemoration are funded.
That's fantastic. And I think what we won't do is enter into our second hour, where we've just kind of crossed into the kind of minute. So if what I can do is to hand over to Cliff to kind of wind up before handing over to me, where we conclude this evening's Cockburn Conversation. Cliff?
Yeah, again, thanks to everybody for listening in and contributing so many good questions. And thanks obviously to Euan for his presentation, and to Terry and the team who made it possible. I think it fits very well within the week as a whole, connecting with last night from Jeff. One of the things Euan and I were chatting about before this was that apparently in Jamaica, one of the ways in which a slave owner with Scottish links could be sure of identifying his slaves was he had his own tartan that they could wear. So there are lots of international connections. I think what we're seeing over these last couple of nights is the internationalization of the notion of Scottish heritage and the ways in which that's been contested, appropriated even in this particular case. So very complex discussion, as Euan has said, with several different dimensions to it. But I'm sure that we can look forward now to the rest of the week. We've got Lisa Williams, I think, tomorrow night on BAME connections into Edinburgh and Scotland. Then Andrew Crummy on Thursday about Craigmillar Festival Society. And then on Friday, it's Where Are the Women? And we'll be looking particularly at the kind of hidden histories of women in particularly Edinburgh, but also more widely in Scotland. So we hope you'll be able to stay with us through the week. Don't forget to look to the new website tomorrow. We've just been waiting 5 years for this. It should be there tomorrow. And that will give you details of an exciting weekend that we've got as part of the virtual Doors Open Day that the Cockburn is running again. So thanks to everybody. Back to Terry, and good night to everyone.
Yes. Thank you very much, Cliff. And indeed, a reminder is hopefully tomorrow, cockernassociation.org.uk/Doors Open Day. And there's kind of over 70 venues that are participating in this year's virtual Doors Open Days event. It's absolutely kind of spectacular, and you can enjoy it all over a cup of coffee in the morning or a bowl of soup at lunch or any other kind of time in the day. So please do join us. And a reminder that going on to Eventbrite to book any further Cockburn conversations as we go forward. And if you've enjoyed tonight's kind of event or do appreciate Doors Open Days or the work of the Cockburn, please do become a member or make a donation to us. Every penny does help to our work. So it just kind of falls to me to thank you very much to Professor Hague and Professor Hague. Having two Professor Hague so kind of on one bill is just absolutely fantastic value for money, even though it's kind of free. And it's been a most enlightening and thoroughly enjoyable Cockburn conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for inviting me.
And keep safe, everyone.